When a 12-year-old boy vanishes on his early morning paper route, it would set into motion a mystery that leads to places nobody could have expected. The investigation launched a whirlwind of emotions, false leads, and unanswered questions. The town rallied together, desperate for answers, but as the years passed, hope began to fade. Over the years, rumors and speculation swirled, painting a haunting picture of corruption, dark secrets, and a sinister underground world. Was he a victim of human trafficking? We will journey into the shadows, peeling back layers of the last 4 decades, and we will see the depths of a mother's love for her son and the amazing things she did to help others in her relentless search for justice. This is the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. I'm Amy, and this is the Crime Queen. I grew up in rural Iowa. Everybody knew everybody and their family. I went to a small elementary school that had a total enrollment of less than 65 students for K through 5th grade. The school had been much larger at one time, but by the time I entered it, the upstairs had been walled off and only the lower level classrooms were in use. The classes were so small that 2 grades were in a single classroom. 2nd and 3rd grade were together, and 4th and 5th grade were together. Kindergarten and 1st grade each had their own room, but were connected by a door that remained closed most of the time. The kindergarten room was the first room on the left when you entered through the front doors of the school. The room smelled of old books and crayons and paste. Short tables and tiny chairs lined one wall, and a semicircle rainbow-shaped desk was in the back corner, opposite a mat-lined quiet area. The room also had its own bathroom, with a small child-sized toilet and sink. Kindergarten was its own little protected world at that school. We only went through the long, partially darkened hallway to go to the gym and for lunch. At lunchtime, we would line up in single file and walk our tiny little bodies down the hall to the cafeteria. We would stand on the concrete floors in that darkened hallway, waiting to inch our way into the actual lunchroom. On the wall, just before the lunchroom, was a large bulletin board. It was the same bulletin board that was in the school hallways everywhere in the 1980s. It had corrugated colored paper borders that corresponded with the season or holiday that was coming. Laminated paper shapes of autumn-colored leaves in the fall set against orange paper, snowflakes in the winter set on blue paper, and the hopeful spring flowers and sun, usually on yellow or light green paper. The lunch menu for the current month would be stapled on the end corner nearest the entrance, so you could read what was being served just before you walked in and saw them serving it. Sometimes the long bulletin board would display artwork from the older kids and notices about things we paid no attention to. As a little kindergartner, most of the decorations and displayed items were too high to see very well. But hanging just below the edge of the board, just above head level, but large enough to fully absorb, was a flyer with "missing" in bold black letters across the top, and the name Johnny Gosch beneath his smiling face. Johnny Gosch was missing from Des Moines, not very far from our tiny little town. It was a place I knew and went to several times per year. As kindergarten faded into 1st grade, my reading ability improved. Now I could read details. He had been delivering newspapers, suspected kidnapping. I don't remember what the reward started at, but I do remember it went up. I recall it being the topic of young elementary school talk while we stood in line for lunch. We all saw his picture, every day. I'm not sure when the sketch of the suspect first appeared, but we all stared at the bad man's face and burned it into our minds. Then, at the beginning of 2nd grade, the unthinkable happened. Another missing boy, from Des Moines, delivering papers, suspected kidnapping. The other kids seemed to be oblivious to the poster by then, but I wasn't. I was terrified. How could this happen? Didn't they show these kids the same stranger danger videos we had to watch? Who was stealing kids from their paper routes? This started me down the path of my obsession with true crimes. I wanted to learn everything about every case I heard anything about. My grandma was a journalist and often took me with her when she covered events, conducted interviews, and put her stories together on her typewriter. I often spent time at the newspaper where she worked, marveling over the large rolls of paper and enjoying the smell of the ink in the air. She gave me the gift of an insatiable hunger to read and fed it by lending me the true crime paperback leftovers she had already devoured. And so, as I got older, I sought all the information I could find on the first case that sparked the fire when I was just a tiny little girl: the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. Johnny Gosch was a friendly and sweet 12-year-old boy. He had gotten a job as a paper delivery boy to save up for a dirt bike. He had announced he thought he was old enough to do his paper route by himself, but his parents told him no. But on September 5th, 1982, Johnny got up for his route and did not wake his parents. A neighbor heard the wheels squeaking on his wagon just before 6 a.m. as Johnny set off for his Sunday morning paper delivery with his dachshund, Gretchen. He went to the drop-off spot where all the paper boys picked up their bundles. He was approached by a man in a car asking for directions. Johnny did not speak to him, but kept walking to pick up his papers. The man then did a U-turn and parked next to the curb. He continued asking the kids who were folding their newspapers for directions. Johnny told another boy he thought the man, who was slurring his words, was weird. Johnny told the other boy he was scared and he was going home. Alone with his wagon and his little dog, Johnny headed back down the sidewalk toward his home. The other boys said at this time, the man got back into his car, flicked his dome light on and off 3 times, and drove in the same direction Johnny was walking. At 7:45, the family received a call from a neighbor asking why he hadn't received his paper yet. The little dog Gretchen had returned home, but Johnny had not. His father, John Gosch Sr., quickly set out to search for his son. All he found was his little red wagon with all his newspapers still in it. Neighbors reported that John delivered all of Johnny's papers, then returned home to tell Noreen Johnny was missing. The couple called the police department, who took nearly an hour to make the 10-block trip from the department to the Gosch's home. During the time spent waiting for the police, Noreen had called all the boys on Johnny's paper route. They told her about the suspicious man in the car and the flicking of the dome light. There was also a father of one of the boys who had witnessed the man in the car asking the boys for directions. Even with these witnesses, police dismissed Johnny as a runaway and said in 72 hours they could declare him missing and then begin their search. John and Noreen knew their son had been abducted and had not run away. They were not going to sit and wait until police realized what they already knew. They contacted everyone they could think of and called the newspapers to get Johnny's info out to as many people as possible. They printed thousands of posters with their own phone number on it to take any tips anyone had. The frantic parents were frustrated with local police's response and hired their own private detectives soon after their son's disappearance. There were several things that had happened in the weeks before Johnny went missing that hadn't stood out before, but now they wondered if they could be connected. The Gosches had been receiving early morning hang-up calls. There had been a vehicle with license plates from California spotted taking pictures of the area and of Johnny. And on the Friday before he went missing, there had been an interaction at a football game where Johnny was seen speaking to a police officer under the bleachers. Noreen shared this information with the police. The Gosch's relentless search seemed to strike an unpleasant chord with the West Des Moines Police Department. Noreen especially seemed to irritate Police Chief Orville Cooney, who was reported to have climbed up on a park bench with a bullhorn and told people who had gathered to help search for the boy to go home because he was a runaway and hadn't been kidnapped. This was an early example of the difficult relationship between the Gosch family and the police department. Over the next couple of months, the search for Johnny seemed to go nowhere. About a month after Johnny's abduction, Noreen saw a story about 2 Des Moines girls who had been abducted and sex trafficked in Nebraska. She contacted the police and asked Chief Cooney to investigate this. He refused. Knowing she had to get this information out, Noreen held a press conference to draw attention to this incident and point out that her son may have been taken by the same people. Now, she was rewarded for this effort with death threats, telling her to stop making waves. The Gosch's private investigator, Dennis Whelan, believed that Johnny had been abducted by a sex trafficking ring. His investigation uncovered a group of pedophiles who were operating in public, almost in plain sight. In December of 1982, just 3 months after Johnny was taken, Whelan attended a child auction in Houston that was organized by a group of pedophiles. He did not find Johnny. On January 2nd, 1983, in a Des Moines Register article titled "Anger's Flare as Gosch Hunt Drags," Chief Cooney said, quote, "I really don't give a damn what Noreen Gosch has to say. I really don't give a damn what she thinks. I'm interested in the boy and what we can do to find him. I'm kind of sick of her." The misogyny. Side note, 6 months later, Cooney was forced to resign amidst reports of misconduct, being drunk on the job, and complaints from 18 of his officers. We will come back to him later. Within 6 months of Johnny's abduction, Noreen was also contacted by a young man named Paul Bishop. He identified himself as a CIA asset. He informed Noreen that there was a pedophile ring known to the CIA who had kidnapped her son. He also drew her a detailed map of the planned kidnapping of her son. 7 months after Johnny's abduction, on March 2nd, 1983, a woman called police about a disturbing encounter. She saw a boy who was being chased by 2 men, and he came running up to her. The boy frantically told her, "Please, lady, help me. My name is John David Gosch." The 2 men then dragged him away. At the time, police dismissed the report as a family situation. Now, this woman later saw Johnny's photograph on TV and recognized him as the boy who had come to her for help. She called the police again, and the report made it back to the Gosch family private investigator and the FBI, who both agreed the boy was, in fact, Johnny. This would not be the last sighting. In June of 1984, Noreen was contacted by a local private investigator named Sam Soda. He claimed to have very valuable information about Johnny's disappearance. Noreen agreed to meet him. She told Paul Bishop about the call from this Sam. Paul told her he didn't trust this man. She went to his office with a tape recorder. Noreen recorded as Sam told her that there would be another kidnapping in the south side of Des Moines. He told her it would be another paperboy and it would happen the second weekend in August. He claimed to have received this information through an informant. Noreen didn't understand why he didn't go to the police with this information, but she did. Armed with the tape recording of their conversation, Noreen tried unsuccessfully to get law enforcement to listen. The only person willing to listen to her recording was a Des Moines Register reporter. In the search for her son, Noreen took on a new role as a child safety advocate. Partnered with John Walsh, yes, that John Walsh, they pushed Congress to pass the Missing Children's Assistance Act, which established the National Resource Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The National 24-hour toll-free hotline was also established. NCMEC, as it's called, was designed as a resource for parents, children, law enforcement, schools, and the public about ways to assist in finding missing children and ways to prevent abduction and abuse. She looked back on the mistakes made in Johnny's case. She wanted to make certain no other family experienced what they had. The Gosches also lobbied Iowa legislators, and on July 1st, 1984, the Johnny Gosch bill was put into law. This law requires law enforcement's immediate involvement when a child goes missing. 40 other states followed suit. August 14th, 1984, marked another shocking event that felt like deja vu. 13-year-old Eugene Martin, a Des Moines Register paper delivery boy, disappeared. He normally delivered the Sunday morning papers with his older stepbrother, but this particular morning, he went alone. Customers started calling about not receiving their newspapers, and the manager went out to find where Eugene was. At about 6:15, the manager found Eugene's bag with 10 folded papers inside. Within a couple hours, Eugene had been reported as missing, and the search for him began. Witnesses report seeing him speaking to a clean-shaven man between 30 and 40, about 5'9" with a medium build. Police treated it as an abduction from the moment they received the call, in part due to the Johnny Gosch bill. The Des Moines Register ran full-page ads about the missing boys, and a local trucking company put poster-sized images of the missing boys on their trucks. One of Eugene's relatives worked at Anderson Erickson, a large local dairy. The relative reached out to the company's president. The dairy wanted to help in the search for Eugene and for Johnny. They featured both missing boys' pictures on the sides of their milk cartons, two of the first missing children to be shared this way. A week later, Prairie Farms, also located in Des Moines, followed suit. This program caught on in the Midwest and expanded nationwide. There would ultimately be over 700 dairies that took part in sharing pictures of missing children, distributing approximately 3 billion milk cartons. The similarities to Johnny's case could not be overlooked, nor could the chilling prediction of this abduction from Sam Soda. Paul Bishop told Noreen that Sam was involved in Eugene's abduction and Johnny's. Eugene Martin has never been found. In June of 1985, a $1 bill was found in Sioux City, Iowa. On the bill was written, "I am alive, Johnny Gosch." The bill was sent for analysis of the handwriting, and 3 experts, along with the Gosch family, believed it to be Johnny's handwriting. The Gosches also received a letter from a man claiming to know where their son was being held. Robert Meyer II wrote that he had been a guard for a motorcycle group who had abducted Johnny. Noreen Gosch met with the man in Kansas City and had given him checks totaling $11,000. He promised her a written account of what happened to her son. He said her son was in Mexico City, and for another $100,000, he would return her son to her. The FBI arrested him against Noreen's wishes. She was furious. She claimed that the FBI had ruined the chance for her son to be returned and destroyed their credibility to anyone else who would reach out to them with information about their missing son. With the extortion and the threats being received, Noreen feared for her family's safety. She held a press conference where she stated that they knew who had kidnapped Johnny. She said that there were 3 men from Des Moines and a contact in Houston. She also said the police knew who these men were and were doing everything in their power to bring them to justice. She said that her announcement might make the people want to flee, but pointed out that would be revealing too, wouldn't it? It is not known if there were actual suspects or this was a ruse put out, but following the press conference, the harassment of the family stopped. Sam Soda also left the Des Moines area. On March 29th, 1986, the day before Easter Sunday, 13-year-old Mark James Warren Allen told his mother he was walking to a friend's house down the street. He said to his mother, "Save me some pizza, Mom. I'll be hungry when I get home." He never arrived at his friend's house, and he hasn't been seen since that day. His mother said, quote, "He waved when he got to the bushes, and I waved at him, and that was that. And I never saw him again." Allen's mother felt the police response was not what it should be. She felt that the 2 missing paper boys might be connected, but police were reluctant in her son's investigation. The police disagreed and said that they followed up on every leads that didn't pan out. Mark Allen is still missing. In 1988, 5.5 years after his abduction, a typed letter arrived at the Gosch home on Valentine's Day. The letter was postmarked Idaho. The author claimed to be Johnny. In the letter, he said his captors had changed his looks, dyed his hair, and forced him to do disgusting things. He also referenced the Oklahoma sighting, where he asked the woman for help. Now, the location of that incident had never been made public. He asked for his family's love and forgiveness, although he would never be allowed to return to them. The letter was signed in a distinct way. "Your son, Johnny Gosch," a way he used to sign notes. In September of 1990, the Gosch family stated publicly that their investigation had wound down. They still believed their son had been abducted by child sex trafficking ring and had been moved around the country. Then they received a tip from an attorney in Nebraska named John DeCamp. DeCamp represented a victim of a major child sex ring who was incarcerated on molestation charges. DeCamp was reading through a transcript of his client's interview with a psychiatrist when he came across an account involving a newspaper carrier from Iowa. DeCamp went on to verify the date stated by his client matched the date of Johnny Gosch's abduction. He reached out to the Gosch family, letting them know his client had confessed to assisting in the abduction of their son. John Gosch Sr. took the call and didn't tell his wife about the new information. John was skeptical, but traveled to the Lincoln Correctional Center, just a couple hours away, to meet with DeCamp's client, Paul Bonacci. Paul Bonacci was a victim of the Franklin Credit Union child sex ring. This was a politically connected child sex trafficking ring in Omaha during the 1980s. Children from the Boys Town Orphanage and Nebraska foster care system were kidnapped and abused at sex parties. The credit union was operated by a Republican power broker named Lawrence King. The sex parties were attended by political and business elites. Children were also flown around the country, often to Washington, D.C., to be abused. King would gather evidence of the abuse and use it to blackmail participants. Now, that is another huge case that would be an entire series in and of itself. If you're interested in looking it up, be prepared. With ties to NAMBLA and high-ranking political and military officials, the victimization of these children is heart-wrenching. The victims, who later came forward, including Paul Bonacci, were then victimized again as adults. Several were legally punished for coming forward with their stories as a warning to others. When John Gosch Sr. walked in to meet with Paul Bonacci, he asked if Bonacci knew who he was. Bonacci responded with, quote, "You look like, it can't be, the eyes. You look like Johnny Gosch." Although reluctant at first, it was reported that John came away from this meeting believing Bonacci. Years later, he would claim differently. John hired an Omaha-based private investigator, Roy Stevens, who spent hundreds of hours tracking leads and interviewing Bonacci. Paul Bonacci told Stevens that they had stayed at a local motel the night before the abduction. He said the local contacts arrived and had pictures of Johnny. Bonacci told Stevens that there was a man called Emilio who made his living from abducting and selling children. He claimed Emilio was brought in to help abduct Johnny and that he had been the driver of the blue car, the man who had asked for directions and flicked the dome light on and off. Bonacci said that he had been hiding in the back seat of that car and was tasked with holding Johnny down in the back seat and placing a rag with chloroform on it over his face to knock him out. He said the car was stopped and Johnny was shoved into the back seat. Bonacci used the chloroform to knock him out, and then an unconscious Johnny was moved to another car, and then another. They drove to Council Bluffs on the Nebraska border, and then Johnny was taken to a farmhouse in Sioux City where he was held for a week. While the claims seem unbelievable, Stevens found that everything Bonacci told him that he was able to verify checked out. The investigator would later say there was nothing Bonacci told him that wasn't true. In 1991, Stevens traveled to Des Moines to share the videos of Paul Bonacci telling his story with Noreen. She was skeptical. As a test, Noreen sent a photo, without any explanation, to the investigator to present to Bonacci. The photo was mixed in with a dozen other photos and presented to Paul. He was asked if he recognized any of the people in the photos. He identified the photo of the man Noreen sent as being the local contact in Des Moines. This was the man who came to the motel the night before the kidnapping with the photo of Johnny, saying this was the kid they were going to take. He said his name was Sam. The photograph was of Sam Soda, who the Gosches had suspected was involved since 1986. Noreen then traveled to Nebraska to meet with Bonacci and see for herself if this man could be believed. He knew personal details about her son that had never been released. He told her about 2 scars on Johnny's leg and on his tongue. He also told her that Johnny would stutter when he was stressed. He said Johnny had told him about his mom taking him with her to her yoga classes, and how he would use meditation she taught him. This, coupled with the details about the abduction that had not been made public, convinced Noreen this man was telling the truth. And so, Paul Bonacci then told Noreen what happened to her son. He told her about the photos and the night before the abduction. He said the morning Johnny was taken, there had been 3 vehicles used. This was a detail not released to the public that had been discovered by the Gosch's private investigators. There had been a van seen in the neighborhood that morning. Investigators spoke to a man who had noticed the van parked on the side of the street with its motor running. He said after a while another car drove up and he witnessed the passengers of the car loading something large, covered with a blanket, into the van. Bonacci told about covering Johnny, who was unconscious, with a blanket before moving him to a van driven by a guy named Tony. He said Sam was waiting nearby in a station wagon. The Iowa DMV verified that Sam Soda owned a station wagon matching Bonacci's description at the time of the abduction. Bonacci said that while Johnny was being held at Charlie's farm in Sioux City, that he was the first person to molest Johnny and that it was filmed. He said that Johnny was later sold to a man from Colorado called the Colonel. While there had never been sightings or a link to Johnny being in Colorado, there had been an interesting bit of information relayed to the Gosches. While family friends were visiting Colorado, they had stopped to eat at a restaurant. In one of the bathroom stalls, the message, "Johnny Gosch was here," had been written on the wall. Roy Stevens traveled to the restaurant and took pictures of the outside of the restaurant and the interior and the bathroom walls. Stevens then took the pictures to Bonacci, who accurately described the distinct interior of this restaurant. He said he had been there with Johnny and another boy painting their nails. He said they wrote on the wall in red nail polish. The message had been written in red nail polish. Bonacci also received letters while he was in jail with references to JG, Johnny, Emilio, and the Colonel. These letters also had other information referencing JG getting face surgery, and JG was not the only boy we got from Des Moines. Roy Stevens verified all that he could and told Noreen he believed that Bonacci was telling the truth. Armed with this, Noreen went to the West Des Moines police. Now, one would think the police would have set up an interview right away, anxious to rescue a victim, solve one of their biggest cases, and possibly shut down a sex trafficking ring. But one would be wrong. They never even conducted an interview with Paul Bonacci. It was reported that the West Des Moines Police Department contacted one of Bonacci's siblings, who said he had been home on the day Johnny was abducted. Now, I'm not going to say this person didn't have a good memory because I don't know. But if the police called me and asked where my sibling had been on a particular day nearly 10 years ago, I don't think I could honestly answer that question. I will also point out that it only takes 2 hours to drive from Des Moines to Omaha, and Lincoln is just another 45 minutes from there. Discouraged by the ongoing apathetic response from the local police department, Noreen did what she had been doing since her son was taken. She went beyond the police and reached out to friends she had made in her advocacy work. Enter John Walsh and America's Most Wanted. In 1992, John Walsh took the new information and put their investigators on it. They traveled to Colorado. They found the house that Paul Bonacci claimed children had been held at. The now abandoned house was owned by a prison guard who had disappeared. The house was as Paul had described it, and they found evidence supporting his claims. He told of an area where children were kept. They found an area matching his description. There were initials carved into the wood rafters, which was located under the main house. Although some people thought these were crazy conspiracy theories, there was evidence that some of these things were true. Well, they couldn't prove that the kids were held there without getting permission to do a more thorough investigation of the property. The abandoned property owned by someone who had disappeared was another interesting piece of this puzzle. While West Des Moines police seemed to dismiss tips brought to them by Noreen, other law enforcement agencies were much more eager to assist in the investigation. One of the leads generated by Paul Bonacci was about a man named Charlie, whose farm was used to hold Johnny for the week after his abduction. Paul Bonacci drew a picture of the man he only knew as Charlie, who had the farm in Sioux City. Roy Stevens took this to Sioux City authorities, and together they matched the drawing to a man named Charlie Kerr. Kerr was known to Sioux City authorities and had a lengthy rap sheet for sexual offenses against children. This started a months-long surveillance of Kerr and his farm. When an arrest was imminent, the county attorney called Noreen to let her know they were about to arrest Charlie Kerr. Noreen shared this information with her husband, John. This would lead to the event that would end the Gosch's marriage. Sioux City authorities were about to make an arrest of a known pedophile who Paul Bonacci had identified as holding Johnny Gosch for a week after his abduction. Bonacci stated that he only knew his first name, but he had been known to him within the trafficking ring, which Bonacci had been a longtime victim of. Noreen Gosch told her husband of the impending arrest. What happened next is truly unbelievable. Noreen received another call from the Sioux County attorney, who was furious. Her husband had shown up where Kerr lived. John had gone inside and talked to Charlie Kerr, causing him to flee the area and avoid arrest. This was the final straw for Noreen. Her husband had tipped off one of the suspected perpetrators of her son's abduction and sabotaged his arrest. The couple divorced shortly after. Now, after the divorce, John disappeared from public view. The few times he would make comments, it was usually to disagree with anything Noreen said. Many times he would contradict statements he had previously made. Why would someone do this? Well, Noreen's investigation came up with some shocking allegations that would make her question everything she thought she knew about her ex-husband, and possibly implicated him as being complicit in their son's abduction. Where we go next is going to sound unbelievable. And at this point, that's a pretty tall hurdle to clear. In 1999, a civil suit Paul Bonacci had filed against Larry King for sexual abuse came to trial. Noreen was called to testify about what she and her investigators had found in regards to this sex trafficking ring. She testified that information Paul Bonacci had given was verified when it could be, and that she believed he was telling the truth. She also stated that she believed the same sex trafficking ring that abused Bonacci had been responsible for the abduction of her son. She was then asked when the last time she saw her son was. Her answer? 2 years ago. This was a bombshell. She went on to explain, Noreen said he arrived in the early morning hours at her apartment, accompanied by another man. He had shown her scars and distinguishing marks to verify his identity before she let him in, but she said when she saw his eyes, she knew it was him. He told her that he had escaped his captors, but it wasn't safe for him to come home. He said that the people who abducted him had evidence of him doing things that would get him in trouble. He also believed they would kill him if they ever found him. She never learned the identity of the man with him, and once they left, she hasn't seen or heard from him again. At this point, everyone had questions. When asked why she didn't call the police and put him under protection, she stated that he would have left immediately if she had tried. The biggest skeptic in this was John Sr. He questioned why Johnny wouldn't have gone to their old house, where John still lived, instead of his mother's apartment. He then went on to accuse her of trying to get on TV more and hoping to move somewhere warm. Noreen responded with the same grace she has shown since Johnny's abduction. She said, quote, "I would think any father would be delighted that his son is alive instead of trying to attack his mother." Indeed. And for those of you wondering, as I did, how would Johnny have known where his mom moved to? Noreen had given a TV interview where she gave her new address and phone number out for Johnny or anyone having tips or information to share, as she always had. After her testimony, the West Des Moines police interviewed her about the late night meeting. They said she had notified them before, but then chose to recant it. They assigned 2 detectives to investigate any new information in the Gosch case. Paul Bonacci won his civil suit against Larry King and was awarded $1 million in damages. He has yet to receive any compensation. Now, this is where this story gets really twisty. I would like to say what follows is information that Noreen has released. Her ex-husband has denied everything she has said, but some of the things have been verified. Some of the people who came forward with information are known to be at odds with Noreen, so a conspiracy seems very unlikely. John, for his part, has publicly changed his statements on many things, often outright contradicting himself from documented previous interviews. What follows are revelations from Noreen's book, Why Johnny Can't Come Home, and the film Who Took Johnny. While many of these accusations have not been corroborated, some of them have. The first question that arises was, why was Johnny alone that particular morning for the first time? Noreen said he had asked to do the route alone, and initially his father said okay. Noreen said no, and she stated Johnny came back down and told her she was the best. Noreen said that John Sr. had been acting erratically several months before Johnny's abduction. She believes that something happened in early 1982 that had him under an enormous amount of stress. She said first he developed a hateful attitude toward all the kids, but mostly on their oldest, Joe. John Sr. arranged a fishing trip to the Ozarks because it, quote, might be their last opportunity to do so, end quote. Upon their return, the boys told their mother they believed their father was very depressed. The following month, John Sr. was on a business trip in Raleigh, North Carolina. He allegedly called his wife, threatening suicide as he could, quote, no longer live with it. Noreen called the police in Raleigh, who performed a welfare check. Then, just 1 month before Johnny was abducted, John Sr. had taken Johnny on a day trip to Omaha and Offutt Air Force Base. When they returned, Johnny seemed to have a foggy recollection of this trip, which in hindsight sends up some red flags. It was after this trip that they began receiving the strange 1 a.m. Sunday morning phone calls. John would always say wrong number and hang up, but Noreen says that morning John gave an affirmative response before hanging up. After Johnny's abduction, they didn't receive any more of these calls. Noreen took on most of the responsibility for keeping Johnny's case in the spotlight, if not all. There was serious trouble brewing in their marriage. She said John started taking lots of business trips without telling Noreen where he was going or even giving her contact info. Many of these trips were to Omaha and Lincoln. They did still make public appearances together regarding Johnny's case. Now, after one event in Davenport, John severely beat Noreen, which was corroborated by a Scott County Sheriff's deputy. The next big red flag pops up when Paul Bonacci's attorney reached out. John had kept this information from Noreen for 6 to 7 months. He claimed, quote, she had completely shut down on the case, and that was why he went alone to meet Bonacci. Now, this statement is contradicted by newspaper quotes from Noreen during that time. If she had completely shut down from the case, she wouldn't be giving interviews to the newspaper. Noreen said it wasn't John who ended up telling her about Paul Bonacci. It was investigator Roy Stevens. She felt that John was trying to keep this information from her. Also during this time, John met with key people from the Franklin Credit Union investigation with a woman, not Noreen, who he introduced as his wife. Noreen claimed this was a private investigator who used to work with Roy Stevens. There is a picture of John and this woman in Noreen's book. The woman claims the image is fake and that she never impersonated Noreen. But what if the image is authentic? That would indicate that John was trying to prevent Noreen from learning certain information. And that visit to Charlie Kerr's house after John was told that an arrest was imminent. The Sioux City Police report confirms that the arrest of one of the suspected perpetrators was sabotaged by Johnny's own father. I just can't get past that one. John did participate in the film Who Took Johnny, an episode of Vanished with Beth Holloway, and a podcast called Faded Out. He claimed the things Bonacci and Noreen said were untrue, but numerous statements he made were at odds with his previously recorded version of what happened. Now, I did not listen to the podcast Faded Out, but it is reported that he claimed he knew immediately Bonacci was a con man. It was said that much of what he said on the podcast was explicitly contradicted, so do with that what you will. He claimed that on the morning of the abduction, he rushed home to call police after finding Johnny's wagon. The neighbors' reports, the police reports, and Noreen all said he delivered the papers, then went home. He also claimed that Johnny sometimes went alone on his paper route. He and Noreen both contradict that statement in repeated interviews from the time of the kidnapping. He also said he never believed the sighting of Johnny in Oklahoma was real, nor the dollar bill found. However, at a press conference, he called the dollar bill a source of additional hope, and in a 1984 documentary called Kidnapped by a Stranger, he referred to the sighting as well as phone calls received by Noreen from Oklahoma City. There are several other documented inconsistencies which question his credibility. Now, that leads down a much darker path and the Franklin Credit Union sex ring. Remember Police Chief Orville Cooney? Noreen was later told by a West Des Moines mayor that Orville Cooney had been involved in the Franklin sex ring and had attended those parties. Although this case has more twists and turns than a roller coaster, at the heart of it is a boy. A boy who was snatched from his life at 12 years old. A boy who would now be a 53-year-old man. Noreen's endless work for this cause has helped countless children. From passing the Johnny Gosch bill and its expansion to helping the push to create the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, her work for missing children and their families cannot be overstated. Noreen has shown up for families whose children have gone missing, helping them navigate the legal and media aspects of a club nobody wants to be a member of. September 5th, 2023 marked 41 years since Johnny Gosch was abducted from his early morning paper route. 41 years later, his case is still open, classified as a missing person, not an abduction. If you have any information about the abduction of Johnny Gosch, Eugene Martin, or Mark Allen, there is an official Johnny Gosch Facebook page, or you can call the 24-hour call center with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Their website is missingkids.org. There they offer tips for keeping your children safe and the steps to take if, heaven forbid, your child goes missing. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Crime Queen.